Everybody, good afternoon and welcome once again to our weekly COVID-19 Public Health Update Media Briefing with Montgomery County Executive Mark Elridge. I'm Lorna Vigili, Hispanic Public Information Officer, and joining us today is Acting Health Officer Dr. James Bridgers. Good afternoon, Dr. Bridgers. As also Dr. Earlsdottir, who is Assistant Chief Administrative Officer, and Sean O'Donnell, Program Administrator, Public Health Emergency Preparedness and Response for the Department of Health and Human Services. Joining us today also is Stephanie Ward, who is our Equity Officer. Reporters, the County Executive has a 1 p.m. hard stop and the rest of the participants a 1:15 p.m. hard stop. We had some issues with the session at the beginning of this presentation. If by any chance your session is terminating, please log back in. And with that, I toss it to you, Mr. County Executive. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, and thank you everybody for joining us today for our weekly media briefing. I'm talking to you from our Annapolis office today. I'm in Annapolis to testify on behalf of Senate Bill 462, a bill that addresses American history content standards and implementation, and also Senate Bill 387, which is a bill looking to address the problem of ghost guns. Yesterday, I testified in person here for the first time since the pandemic started. I testified in support of a bill to support the creation and expansion of our maker economy, and also on the Climate Solutions Now bill, which is critical to the implementation of our climate action plan and our goals to reduce 100% of greenhouse gas emissions by 2035. It is really important that the state do this. We need them as partners. A lot of what the state can do would facilitate our path to clean energy, even if we're slightly ahead of their schedule at this point. Talk a little bit about COVID. This week, our case rate fell below 100 people per 100,000 residents for the first time since December 15th, and it fell to 93.8. We're now in substantial transmission as defined by CDC after being in high transmission for nearly 2 months now. Our test positivity rate also continues to drop. We're now at 3%. This is approximately an 8-fold decrease since the peak of this surge just over a month ago. And there are currently 122 hospitalized COVID patients, which is nearly an 80% reduction since our peak. And as you can see from the chart, in terms of our case rates, we are now the fourth lowest, I believe, in the state. 1, 2, 3, yep, 4. As you can see from this map, we're currently fourth. I would also note that Prince George's County and Baltimore City have lower case rates, and these are two jurisdictions along with us. These two jurisdictions have maintained their mask mandates throughout this surge. This week, Mayor Bowser lifted the District of Columbia's indoor mask mandate and their proof of vaccination requirements at restaurants, gyms, and entertainment venues, despite the objections of some of the DC council members. Next week, Montgomery County's indoor mask mandate will end on Monday, February 21st. And the council president said that on Monday that our proof of vaccination legislation was not going to be voted on at this time. As I stated since last summer, I believe proof of vaccination would be an important tool, especially during surges like the one we seem to be coming out of. That's why in December, I asked the council to implement it as Omicron was surging. That did not happen, and we're now at the same time when we likely would have been discussing ending the program. So I wish we had started it, but we hopefully are going to emerge now in a different place, and we will see what comes next. The variants are always out there. There are some, issues of concern right now with variants, and hopefully we won't see anything like Omicron too soon. I do hope that if and when another surge happens, we're willing to consider these kind of measures to protect the health of the residents. One thing that's happened over the past 2 years is we've learned what works. We've had the opportunity to implement things. We've had the opportunity to compare what happened in Montgomery County to what happened in other jurisdictions. And it's pretty clear that the path we went on helped set us to lower rates of infection and lower rates of death, and hopefully we'll be prepared to do what's necessary should another surge arrive. I want to talk a few minutes about Laura Ingram's interesting television show the other night. As many of you know, over the past 2 years of this pandemic, our county's been extremely careful to enact measures based on data and science to protect as many people as possible. We've listened to the recommendations of our health experts, put politics aside while prioritizing the health and welfare of our residents. The strategy has largely worked, and we've become known for having one of the nation's lowest case rates and highest vaccination rates for a jurisdiction of our size and diversity. Additionally, as we mentioned last week, our efforts have led us to have a death rate that's nearly 1/3 lower than the national average. For these efforts, you can imagine my surprise this week as I received quite the Valentine's Day greeting from Fox News Channel's Laura Ingraham, who referred to me as a tyrant and a few other things, the same epithet that she gave to Mayor Bowser just a couple of weeks earlier. I actually don't care what Ms. Ingram has to say about me. I'm an adult, and I've long learned to ignore playground bullies. As a former elementary school teacher, I'm not surprised by childish behavior, especially from a TV personality and a station that peddles misinformation and Trump propaganda. So I'm not totally surprised. Ms. Ingraham does not understand Montgomery County values. I must defend the over 1 million residents of Montgomery County and the thousands of employees of this government and school system and our hospitals from her attack on our community and the success we've achieved here. For the last 2 years, people in this county have performed countless sacrifices to combat this virus and keep themselves and others safe. They've faced personal and business hardships and have come together as a community to look out for one another. I'm grateful every day to be county executive of a county where people look out for their neighbors, for their family, for strangers who they all care about. If this nation had the same trajectory as Montgomery County, we would have about 300,000 fewer dead Americans today. But if this entire nation followed the ignorance of Ms. Ingraham, Fox News, and former President Trump over the last 2 years, we would surely have seen lower vaccination rates, more hospital systems overwhelmed, and sadly, many more deaths. Years from now, historians recognize how harmful misinformation spewed from right-wing media pontificators was to the health, welfare, economy, and national security of this nation during this pandemic. It is when this history is written that it'll be clear that those who follow the facts and science and be clear who was following the facts and science and who, like Ms. Ingram, were not following the facts and science. They are the biggest obstacles to progress and proper handling of this crisis. That message going out on Fox News that we did things we did not need to do clearly avoids the reality of what we were successful at in the county, what our residents were able to achieve by following that guidance, and apparently comes from some alternate universe. It's clearly false advertising that the word news is attached to Ms. Ingraham's television network. Back to other things, vaccinations and Boosterama. No matter what, we can't be distracted from our mission as a government to do whatever we can do to keep all residents safe and healthy. As we currently, in another lull between potential services, we must continue to focus and prepare for whatever the future is going to bring. The best tool we have to protect our community is vaccinations and boosters. We're still waiting on an emergency use authorization of the Pfizer vaccine in children 6 months to 5 years old. This week, the FDA has postponed the review of data for efficacy from vaccine trials to accommodate the collection of additional data. Pfizer is conducting an ongoing trial of a third vaccine dose for these young children and expects to have that data on 3 doses available in early May. Montgomery County continues to have about 50,000 children in this age range. We're also continuing to focus our community engagement efforts to promote boosters. We're hosting our second Boosterama at Westfield Wheaton on Saturday from 1 to 4. We'll be located outside Dick's Sporting Goods store, and we'll be handing out rapid tests, face masks, raffling some mail gift cards for those who get boosted. And getting boosted is the key to being protected, as you can see from the evidence that exists on COVID. Our booster rates are still hovering around 50% of our eligible population. It's below 50% from our communities of color and younger adults. We have to do better. I want to thank Westfield Wheaton, as well as our partners at Saluda Vienna Star, for their continued efforts and support. But I've got to say that the boosters are really important. This is much different than the flu. And your booster shot is waning in effectiveness after, I think it's down to 5 months now. They're saying that the regular shots we all got, the first two, have lost much of their effectiveness. They are not sufficient to protect us from the viruses, from the virus right now. What the booster shot does is restore the level of protection. And the most important thing is, if you get sick, you are very unlikely to get more than a little sick. And that's significant. If you're not boosted and you get COVID, you have a greater likelihood of getting a worse case of COVID, and that has all kinds of health implications. So getting that booster shot is critical for people to have some assurance that while it's not going to protect everybody, it's going to protect most people, and it's going to keep you safer if you do happen to get COVID. I experienced it personally. I would take my case over a severe case any day. I want to end by talking a little bit about equity. In 1966, Martin Luther King said at the Human Rights Forum, quote, "Of all the forms of inequality, injustice, and health is the most shocking and the most inhuman because it often results in physical death. As we focus on our continued response to and recovery from COVID, we cannot ignore the inequities due to our nation's tragic history of systemic racism. It was serendipitous that just before the pandemic began 2 years ago, Tiffany Ward was confirmed as our county's first chief equity officer. Over the last 2 years, Tiffany's done an incredible job of establishing our Office of Racial Equity and Social Justice, ensuring that this government will be making policy and budget decisions moving forward through an equity lens. Tiffany succeeded in these efforts with no roadmap or blueprint, nor very few positions like hers within local governments to model after. She's not just setting a new course, but trailblazing a new path in governance. One such area of this is the focus of a lot of community debate in the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning's Thrive 2050 General Plan recommendation from Montgomery County. I've had many concerns about the process and the transparency surrounding Thrive, but I'm most concerned about the plan's lack of equity and zero effort to concretely address a severe shortage of affordable housing that projections show will be amplified by projected loss of existing affordable housing units. Park and Planning is estimating between 7,000 and 11,000 existing affordable housing units lost in the next decade, and an increase in new residents whose projected incomes will require even more affordable units to be built. Thrive doesn't address any of this, and I do not know how you can build a plan for Montgomery County's next 30 years without addressing the Montgomery County that exists today and the problems and challenges facing the residents today. This plan does not do that. I'm in total agreement with the Office of Legislative Oversight's assessment of Thrive's lack of focus and attention to equity. They recognize the lack of deep community engagement with communities of color and low-income people. Any plan without the input of communities of color cannot be equitable. While the plan acknowledged the forces of redlining and racially restrictive covenants, there was little else in the report that outlined not only our current but historic inequities that led to land use policies that advantaged white residents and neighborhoods over people of color, and particularly Black residents. Thrive fails to acknowledge the link between housing ownership and the current racial wealth gap. Wealth accumulated through home equity is often used to further education and business opportunities for white residents at the exclusion of people of color, particularly Black residents. In down-to-earth terms, it's the difference between my father being able to get a loan against his house to help someone go to college or to help someone start a business versus somebody who's only going to rent and doesn't have that kind of wealth and cannot borrow against the equity in the house, and therefore may find it difficult to fund their child's college education. This is a real difference in the real world, and the fact that home ownership eludes the Black population in this county more than any other group is a continuing problem. Home values have huge implications for economic and workforce success, and the Thrive plans failed to make that connection. We also agree with the Office of Legislative Oversight's assessment that the Thrive plan should be specific about current inequities. The plan should pinpoint disaggregated data and outline the disparities they intend to close with this new plan. One of the social accomplishments of our racial equity and social justice effort that I'm most proud of is they've asked all of our departments to use a new budget tool to help make budget and other resource decisions. The primary purpose is for the budget equity tool to ask departments questions like, which racial disparity are they targeting? What quantitative data are they using? What community input had they received? And how had they considered the quantitative and qualitative data together? And lastly, what were the anticipated unintended consequences of resource allocation? These questions are very similar to the legislative tool used for racial equity impact assessments that the council's using. The Thrive plan should have used these tools to make this plan racially inequitable. Amazingly, the most important document that was being produced to plot the future of the county was excluded from having to create its own racial equity analysis. How that happened is beyond me. Why it was allowed to happen, I don't know. But I'm glad that Council President Albornoz asked for an evaluation from OLO's Office on Racial Equity, and at least we have something we can work on. But rest assured, it didn't come from the Planning Board. It came from the action of Mr. Albornoz. So thank you very much, and I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Stoddard and Sean O'Donnell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ulrich. So just to add on to the some of the information that was already shared, I'd like to share our county's hospitalization rates as of this week. We've also, in addition to seeing our case rates and our positivity come down, we continue to see hospitalizations with COVID patients reduce. The number of patients in acute care beds is now down to 58 in our primary hospitals and 18 ICU patients in those hospitals, with another 48 acute care or ICU patients in the alternate care center. The total of 122 is, again, a drastic reduction from where we were even a few weeks ago. We're continuing to track deaths related to COVID. Again, we are just coming out of one of the most significant periods of COVID infection rates, and the death tolls are still coming in as of late January, early February. We continue to track these, and the county's rates have gone up a little bit with comparison to the state rates, but are still well below what the county's percentage of the state population are. And we believe that is, again, part of the protective effects of vaccinations in our county, as well as the mask using and spacing that our county residents have done over the last few months. With vaccination rates, our numbers continue to climb slowly with total populations as our 5 to 11-year-olds continue to get vaccinated. That group is now within the high 60th percentile for first doses, and well over 50% now for fully vaccinated. That has now led our fully vaccinated total across the county to be very, very close to 85%. It's, I believe, 84.7 or so percent, but rounded up, we are now in that 85% range. We're looking at the booster, our booster totals now as up-to-date vaccination statuses amongst our county residents. And as you can see from these two charts, the left chart showing our full vaccinations by type, you see the very large peak when we did the initial first and second doses, and some of those first and second doses in blue and green still occurring over the last few months. as we've moved into new age range. You can see the additional doses are far lower than those original totals. Most of those individuals are eligible now for boosters, and we're strongly encouraging that. As you can see from the right, the total individuals coming out for boosters has dropped off significantly over the last few weeks. When we've looked at the vaccination gaps by geography or by race and ethnicity, we see that the first dose rates amongst our racial and ethnic populations, there's not a huge variation between those at this point. However, it's a very different story with our additional doses. We see a larger disparity amongst younger people, but we also see a disparity with our most vulnerable populations, 65 and above. And we strongly encourage all those individuals, if they're eligible, to come out and be boosted, again, to protect themselves from Omicron and any potential future variants. And we've also, we're continuing to update our county partners on the distribution of rapid test kits. These have been distributed through not only our libraries, but also out through private pickups with childcare, private schools, and nonprofits that have helped the county get these out to homebound populations, senior populations. At this date, more than 1.2 million rapid test kits have been distributed. They are still available at our libraries for pickup. You can pick up multiple kits, and as well as mass if you need to pick up for other individuals. That is still possible. We've also shared rapid test kits out with our school partners to ensure that they're able to do testing on site. Now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Stoddard for additional comments.
Actually, I will not provide any comments today to keep us on time and let questions happen. I don't know if Dr. Bridgers has any comments this afternoon.
Thank you, Dr. Stoddard. No additional comments. Just want to professionally thank our county executive and council for continuing to follow the science and the data in their decision-making process.
Thank you, gentlemen. So we can open it up for the Q&A portion of this presentation. Kate Ryan, I hear you're first. You have questions for the county executive and Dr. Bridgers as well?
Yes. Thank you very much. So a quick question on the mask mandate being lifted in the county on the 21st. I understand the Maryland State Board of Education will be looking at its own mask mandate for schools. And from my understanding, the State Board of Education says if at least 80% of the county population where schools are located is fully vaccinated, then schools could lift the mask mandate. Would you all support that if in fact Montgomery County schools say yes, since we're at, I believe you said 85% fully vaccinated now?
Great question, Kate. Is actually 84.7, but close enough. And we will have conversations with MCPS and Dr. McKnight and her senior staff over the next couple of days to look at that. We will also look at those projections as one of the metrics that MSDE also projected as far as being a moderate transmission threshold. But there are other metrics that we need to look at and have those conversations with MCPS outside of that to make sure it's a safe and equitable transition from wearing a mask. Some jurisdictions are looking at the impact that it may have on students who have chronic illnesses or who are immunocompromised. So there are a host of metrics that our team, Mr. O'Donnell and Dr. Stoddard and I will have a conversation with MCPS. So we need to have that conversation to look at the data to see where we are, to just provide the recommendations. And please keep in mind, they will be recommendations that are forthcoming, but it's up to the school system to embrace those recommendations and or all in part or a portion of that as we consider them.
Understood. Mr. Elrich, any concerns on that? Any thoughts about that?
That seems to be the direction that everything is going in right now. So, you know, the big thing for us is to have an eye on how things develop and to, you know, have a set of plans so that we know what to do if things continue to lighten up, and we know what to do if we have to act more aggressively. That at this point, that's probably the most important thing, is to calibrate how you move in both those directions.
Got it. And a quick follow-up on Thrive, if I could, Mr. Eldridge.
Yeah.
Yesterday in the hearing before the council, Casey Anderson, Planning Board Director, said, look, the racial equity, social justice was pretty much baked into that report. He pointed out the numbers of times these references were made. Where precisely did he miss the mark? And is there a group or a number of communities you think that they need to go to directly and hear from?
There is not a single concrete recommendation for how do you address equity and the particularly existing conditions. If you go back and look at the old general plans, you'll see people talking deliberately about building things that would serve the workforce. One of the best examples of that is, the red brick apartments that you see in Wheaton and Silver Spring and Bethesda. They were all planned to house the workforce. They used the word workforce. And the single family neighbors, because they were farther away from where they hoped eventually to build transit, they're meant to be less dense, because apparently in 1964, they knew that putting people farther away from where transit centers would be was not a particularly good idea. So this plan has no concrete. You could not follow this to a conclusion. You would think at the very least you need a recommendation to have no net loss of affordable housing as a county policy. We're projected to lose between 7,000 and 11,000 units over the next 10 years. That's park and planning projections, not my projections. And that's a loss of existing units. According to people in the affordable housing community, this county's lost 30,000 housing units, I think between 2000 and 2015. This plan is utterly silent on what you need to do to build affordable housing. And the irony to me is that we have these large things that we actually rezone. We've done the master plans in Bethesda and White Flint 1, White Flint 2, you name it, where there are large parts of property that are going to be rezoned for higher density uses. Our requirement, despite all the evidence that what we're doing is inadequate, is between 12.5% and 15% affordable units for people basically making between $55,000 and $75,000. All the people, the 50% of people who are below 50,000 income households we have, with something like 47,000 households below $50,000 in income who cannot find affordable housing and are paying 60% of their incomes because there isn't an affordable place for them to live. They have no advice, no recommendations, or nothing that'll deal with that. I can't emphasize the word nothing enough.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Next up, Rebecca Tan, Washington Post. Good afternoon, Rebecca.
Hi, I have a question about something that hasn't been mentioned here today, but it's for County Executive Mark Elrich. To revisit the county's police accountability board proposal, I'm wondering if you can tell me whether you approved of it as it was originally drafted back in December, and I have a quick follow-up question after that.
I didn't approve of it as a plan. We expected it to be modified in the public hearings. Dr. Stoddard could probably describe the process better than I can, but basically, we did not start with all the guidelines we needed from the state to write the plan. We are still waiting, at least we were waiting as of yesterday, for the state to provide guidelines for parts of the plan that we wrote in the absence of the guidelines from the state, because they haven't provided them yet. They've created the problem for every county. We're not the only county that's struggling with this, because we don't know what they're going to propose for regulations or limits on our regulations. So to start with, that bill was sent over by Bob Drummer, and I've got an email and it says from Bob Drummer, and he says, I consulted with council members, but this is not a council bill. That's the starting point. So who wrote it and who started it was on the council side. And apparently council members, none of whom have stood up and said, yeah, I talked to Bob. Some of them consulted with Bob on that draft. I believe the purpose of this was to lay out a bare bones bill that minimally complies with what the state required. And then we would have the public hearings and we would offer amendments. We intend to offer amendments. I know that that there are a number of different groups that intend to offer amendments. I agree with almost every amendment that the Silver Spring Justice Coalition supports. So I think, this bill will be substantially transformed. But it wasn't a bill I approved of, but I didn't feel like I needed to because they needed to get it over to the council to start action on it, because the deadline is we have to have this program in place by July 1. How do you put a program in place if you don't even have the guidelines to write the bill? People have to be for the committees, they need to be interviewed and added to committees. You need to create training programs because these are not committees where you can just walk on that committee with just whatever knowledge you have of day-to-day life. You need to be trained to serve on these committees. Everything was done in a rush to try to start this process rather than do a public process in the beginning and a public process again at the council. So that's my view of it.
Got it. A quick follow-up question on that. This is still the subject of some discussion, but
yeah.
Can you tell me, who do you think should sit on that board?
I would prefer civilians, but I would like to have some ex officio person who knows something about policing. But I don't think they should be voting on the board.
Got it. And you said the executive branch is going to send over amendments, right? When is that going to happen?
We're either going to send them or support the ones that have been sent over. We've had a meeting with the Silver Spring Justice Coalition. I don't see the point of sending over my own to the extent that they're duplicated by other recommendations. So when we go through and have seen everything that's been put on the table, if there's something additional we want to add, we'll add it in. But otherwise, we'll be supporting the amendments that people have already brought over.
And Rebecca, if you've been following the Public Safety Committee hearings, you'll know that I and representatives from the police department have been on all of the hearings so far, as I will be in 40 minutes again. To provide support for, as the county executive alluded to, the amendments that he finds supportive. We've provided comments in reaction to the changes that have been proposed. And just to reiterate what the county executive alluded to, this was sent over really as a boilerplate to get us started, recognizing the timelines that we have to operate under, and the fact that, oh, by the way, the Maryland Police Training and Standards Commission has not set forward regulations which will govern how these boards and committees operate. They're meeting in 10 minutes now to discuss the draft regulations. And so those regulations will not even finalize until April. And so obviously we and every other county in the state of Maryland is reacting to information that we're receiving back channel. But until those regulations as drafted are public, it's very difficult because what we've been told, and again, I don't have a draft to quote this from, but what we've been told is that they will provide some feedback about who can sit on these boards and committees and who cannot, and what the requirements for posting them will be, and what the requirements for the nomination process will be, how often they have to meet. There will be a lot of regulation in there that we'll have to follow because there'll be required regulations. But without knowing them today, it's very difficult to draft enacting legislation over at the county council that is consistent with state guidelines that have not been developed yet. So I encourage you, if you wanted to, the hearing, the special meeting that they've scheduled that starts in 9 minutes now, they'll be starting to discuss these regulations that we haven't seen yet. I don't know if they're even going to show the regulations today. But obviously, until April or so, those probably will not be finalized, and so we're really flying in the dark here on how to successfully complete this process along a timeline to be consistent with state law on July 1st.
Thank you both. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Rebecca. Steve Bonnell, Bethesda Beat. Good afternoon, Steve.
Good afternoon. County Executive, staying on the topic of public safety. The council took kind of what was a technical action yesterday, extending Bill 7-21. This was the bill involving Craig Rice and Sidney Katz that was one of two bills last year in terms of keeping SROs in school or giving there were multiple components to it, but also kind of gave the superintendent more power in that process. where do you and kind of your office stand in terms of, we had a recent interview with the chief that said he'd like to take another look at the community engagement officer program. I wonder where things stand with that, given that this bill being extended seems to indicate to me that there's more work being done here. So I know that's kind of broad, but I want to start there.
I'm not sure how much the council's been privy to discussions that the school board or that the Superintendent McKnight has had. I've been very supportive of letting the school system work this out. This is first and foremost a school question. They're the ones that have to run the schools. They're the ones that have to make sure the kids are safe. They're the ones that have to create an environment where children feel safe and secure in the learning. And so I look at the school system as the primary determinant of how these policies get carried out. I would sure not, try to impose something on them that they don't think will work or they don't think is appropriate. So people can want to do what they want to do and reopen things, but I really, look at this as something that's going to be led by the school system. I think, Dr. McKnight's been clear so far about, we're not going back to the old system. They're making some tweaks. I don't know if everybody, on the council knows all the tweaks they're making. I'm going to work this out. I talked to Dr. McKnight. I talked to the chief, and we'll see how this works out. But the bill didn't, I don't know if the bill created anything new, because I thought the school system had always been primarily the lead on it. They've been very clear this is their system and their buildings, so they're going to set parameters.
Well, this bill was also introduced, though, before you decided not to fund SROs. And I guess what I'm getting at here is, with the community engagement officer program, another thing that Joan told us recently was pretty interesting, is maybe they need to be more present in kind of high activity times in the schools, like lunchtime or, the start of school dismissal. Is that something you're open to, given the conversations you've had with them?
The conversations I've had with them, I'm okay with what they're talking about. They're not talking, they've been very clear. They're not going to bring police in to patrol the halls. Absolutely. And the other thing they're clear about is police are not going to enforce school discipline, period. The role of police in the schools is to deal with police issues, not to deal with discipline issues. And they're not going to go back to being the disciplinarian, which wasn't a job they asked for in the first place. So Dr. McKnight's been clear about what limits she's going to put on, and I'm supportive of what she said.
And Steve, I want to correct one thing you said. The county executive did not cut the funding for the SRO program. No officers were not funded. It was really a change in strategy, with the CEO program being, as county executive just alluded to, not in schools doing discipline, but really responding within their clusters to school-based activities. They're still focused principally on the schools, even as CEOs. That's their primary responsibilities, to respond to school-based incidents. It's just a matter of what other activities they do in their quote-unquote downtime. That's really the focus of the change. And you will see, I think the county, the superintendent presented this to the Board of Education last week, and I think you saw this in the county council session last week as well. They are going to allow greater flexibility for the CEOs to be in the schools during those high peak times, but not wandering in the hallways and being involved in discipline, as the county executive said, being placed in a specific place within the schools so that they're proximal if something happens, but not there to be watching the students or being involved in discipline in any way. So there is some flexibility there, and also just to be able to plan and talk to the administration in each school a bit more so that they understand each other, have relationships built and things like that. And so, but the clear barrier that the county executive has not shifted on at all is the fact that they should not be involved in discipline in the ways that were under the previous SRO program.
So the MOU, though, is the county still have any involvement in that in terms of what's going to be decided between police and the school system, or is that pretty much been settled? I guess that's.
I feel like it's more or less settled. I mean, the MOUs between the school system and the police department. I mean, I was never even asked to sign the MOU. We've tried to provide support and some guidance. And so I've, made it clear to Dr. McKnight that I'll support the direction she wants to go in. I'm a former school teacher. I do believe very strongly that that space ought to be looked after first and foremost by educators.
And last question here about kind of the DC kind of backtracking from the Vax passport for businesses. This is kind of a wonky question, but what legally prevents the executive office? Obviously Bowser did that on her own and then decided to backtrack. I guess I should ask this when you initially proposed it. What prevents you from taking unilateral action versus having to get it through Board of Health action? Maybe Earl or someone else can better field that. But
I think DC is more like a state government. It's like a state government, and she's more like a governor, and I'm not. So if you remember, Larry Hogan was able to say, for example, you guys are no longer issuing orders regarding schools. That was something he had the ability to take away. So at this point, without the emergency order, we are basically the council acts as the Board of Health. We make recommendations. Ultimately, they have to enact them. So I can't do that.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. I do not see any more questions or requests for questions from reporters, members of the media. Going once, going twice. Mr. County Executive, you do have to go. Thank you for joining us, everybody. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Stay safe. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon, everyone.